Okay, thank you all for coming, and thanks for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share my work. My name is Shibani, and I'm a PhD student at the Connected Intelligence Center at UTS. And as you already know, my supervisors are Simon Buckinghamshire and Simon Knight, and I'm going to be presenting about augmenting pedagogic writing practice with contextualizable learning analytics, and we'll be looking at it in the whole presentation. I'm going to unpack all of these a bit. Okay, first, a bit about myself. I'm originally from India. A lot of you don't know about me, so I thought I'll give a bit of introduction. And so I did my undergraduate in computer science engineering, and I worked as a software engineer for a while. So I have an IT background, and then I did a master's in information studies in Singapore. And I was working as a research associate and research assistant in the National Institute of Education in Singapore, which does a lot of amazing education research, and they do a lot of research and practice, embedding things into curriculum. So that's where my introduction to education research came about. And I did my first project in learning analytics, where I did some text analytics and working with teamwork, finding ways of automatically identifying teamwork from school students in a collaborative problem solving environment. And I used some text analysis to kind of automatically find teamwork from chat logs of students. So that was my introduction to learning analytics. So I was a bit interested, and I was thinking I should do a PhD in this topic. So I moved to Australia, and I'd completed 2 years of my PhD in learning analytics, and this is my final year of PhD. Okay, so this is going to be the overview of my talk today. I'm going to be giving an introduction of learning analytics and its general promise of scalability or generalizability. And then I'm going to be talking about contextualizable learning analytics design. I'll be talking about this automated writing feedback example, and then augmenting existing pedagogic practice with learning analytics. I'll talk about a few examples and give some empirical evaluations from my work, and then a few implications, and hopefully we'll have a lot of time for discussion, comments, and I'm also eager to hear about your ideas, comments, and etc. Okay, general feel about the room. How many of you are familiar with what learning analytics is? Okay, quite a lot of you, but for those who are not very sure about it, this is the most common definition of learning analytics from the first Learning Analytics Conference and the Society of Learning Analytics Research. So it's about the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learners. So a lot of emphasis about data from learners, and for the purposes of understanding and optimizing learning. So using data analytics for improving teaching and learning. So that's learning analytics in short. So there are a lot of branches of learning analytics and different types of research within that, but the whole big aim of learning analytics is to improve learning and using data for that. So this learning analytics actually emerged from the emergence of big data. As you know, there's data everywhere. There's a lot of digitization, and everywhere we see there's so much of data. So learning analytics emerged to tackle this problem, as well as the affordances of what we can do with big data. So as you know, there was data already in previous education research. A lot of educators were working with data, but the amount of data and the kind of granularity of data from different sources was just not possible earlier. But with all the affordances we have today, it's now made possible. So that's what learning analytics actually promised to do. So there's a lot of emphasis on big data, scaling up to a lot of people, generalizing it, generalizable solutions which can work with a lot of people. So there was always a big promise with the numbers. But, so as you know, there's always a but. And so education by itself is very contextual, as you know. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach for education, because there's so many factors like the educator, the teaching method, the instruction, the task design. There's so many things that actually impact learning in the student. So we can't come up with generalized solutions that would work exactly the same way in all solutions. So some of them may work well in few contexts, they may not work as well in other contexts, and we might need some tweaking. So that's a problem. So how do we bring this balance between scalability and contextualization, right? So we also want to impact many learners at scale. So there's this scalability and generalization, but we do want to have that context and the learning, which is ultimately important for learning, because the ultimate goal of learning analytics is to impact learners. So we do have to find the balance between these two factors. And it also ties back to the gap we generally find in technology enhanced learning, because there's a potential use of the technology, but there's always like a gap between the potential use and the actual use, because sometimes students don't find the value of it, or the educators don't find the value of it. So a very good high quality technology is there, but it just doesn't meet the actual use of how it's being used in education. So we need to find this gap of find ways to bridge this gap and bring the context back to learning analytics. So how do we do that? One easy way to do it is actually to bring it back and tie it back with the learning design, because learning design has activities which are planned for the learning of the user, of the students. So we have to tie it back to learning design, and hopefully the learning analytics and learning design are aligned to each other, and the ways that they can both feed on to each other. So this is the general idea, but I'm going to introduce a conceptual model for doing this exactly. How do we bring this context back to learning analytics? So I'm introducing this contextualizable learning analytics design model. It's actually from a paper which is currently under review, where we introduce certain elements which can be used to implement this context in learning analytics. So there are a few learning design components which are in blue here, and there are learning analytics components. And we propose that they have to be really working synchronously, and the gears have to be meshed together, because the metaphor of a gear means that the whole gears have to work with each other and in sync, so that the whole mechanism will work. So if they're working in opposite directions, or if one is favored over the other, like the analytics is favored over the learning design itself, the whole system will not work as we expect. It might just fail. So going deeper, and as you see, the educators also play a very big role. It makes no sense to take them out of the learning analytics and just develop tools and put it in front of them and ask them to use it. We have to actually work along with them to make it really meaningful for their students and learners. And I'm going to step through these elements in a bit more detail. So the first one is the assessment. So that's the learning objective the students are meant to have. So that's the main thing that we want the learning analytics to be aligned to, because if it doesn't look meaningful for the students, they're not going to use it. If it's not aligned to their curriculum, they might not know the value of the learning analytics tools. So that's the first bit here. And it also makes sure that the features in learning analytics are mapped back to the assessment, because these features are not the features that you see in tools, not about the system features, but actually the features from the data itself that we think are important, and we have to bring it back to bring them to the attention of the user, of the student, for instance. So these work hand in hand, and so we make sure that the relevant features are identified from the data to be shown back to the user. And the next is the feedback and UI. This again is the main interface which the student interacts with. So this has to be also tuned in synchronously, so it's meaningful for the user. And the final one is the task design, which is an aspect of learning design, which brings all the activities together and ties it back to the pedagogic theory, making sure those activities the students involved in are leading to some kind of learning for the students. So these are all a bit abstract, but I'll come to a bit more examples so you can clearly see how they come together. But the example I'm going to be talking about today is actually writing. So I think every one of you have seen very different pieces of writing. We've seen good writing, which is excellent and you really want to read, you enjoy reading, but you've also seen some terrible writing. You just don't want to read anymore because it might even have the content, but it's just not so easy to comprehend, right? So there's so many different types of writing. And writing by itself is hard for students. A lot of students struggle with it, including me. In fact, this is a PhD comic, and sometimes I also feel this way. So thinking writing shouldn't be hard, it's just transferring your thoughts from your head to the computer, but the distance between that head and the computer is just too much. It's just really hard to get it from here to the computer. So this is the mindset of students, and it's a very common problem. So it's known that students need support for writing. And one way to give this support is to give formative feedback on the writing. So every draft they write, giving them feedback on what to improve, what are the aspects of the writing they can improve, and so on. In the ideal scenario, educators should be, we would all love to give feedback to individual drafts of every student, giving them personalized feedback, but as time and resources are not usually enough, especially for those very big classes. We can't imagine giving feedback to all students at scale. So this is where technology can help, and writing analytics is that field of learning analytics which is focused on writing or written text. So analysis of text for understanding the processes and products, and also it involves supporting students with the provision of automated writing feedback. So this is the field of subdomain of learning analytics, which I'm going to be talking about. And I'm going to be talking more about the feedback tools itself, which give feedback on many different features of text, like grammar, word usage, coherence, complexity, and all of these features. So a very common example is Grammarly, which a lot of students use. But that's just on the surface level. It's just a surface level feature, like grammar and spelling, and they're usually universally same. If it's wrong, it's wrong. There's not a lot of context to it. But also other tools which are developed to look at these texts. So for instance, Cometrics is one example, which provides a number of text indices from a written text, saying, giving out measures of how good the text is in terms of narrativity or cohesion, how cohesive the concepts are from one paragraph to the other, or how simple the words are, and so on. So based on these features, then we can give feedback to students further, saying, you're probably not good in narrativity, you should improve that, and so on. This is one example, and there's another one called Glossa, which was actually developed here in Sydney University some years ago, I think. And it gives feedback on structure, the coherence, the topics in the text itself, and what keywords are in the text. So it gives students something to reflect on their text. And there's one from Turnitin, which is quite a recent one, which is on revision. It's called Revision 2, and so it gives feedback on signals, kind of produces signals on how good the text is in terms of the focus, language, evidence, and so on. And then it gives further feedback on the language to improve parts of these texts. So these are just a few examples, and the one I'm going to talk about today in detail is the one from the Connected Intelligence Center. It's called ACA Writer, short for Academic Writer. So it's a web-based tool that provides formative feedback on rhetorical moves in writing. We'll come to that in a minute. And so it's been trialed and researched for quite a few years in the Connected Intelligence Center, and it has been also, now we also have an open source release of the tool for other universities to use, and so on. So this is what a rhetorical move is. So how many of you have heard of this term? Because I didn't know about it before I started my PhD. Okay, not many. So rhetorical move is a linguistic term which refers to a unit of text that performs a communicative function. So, and it uses some linguistic cues to make it, to convey the purpose of the text to your reader. So for instance, I'm saying, it is important to note that the policy applies to all universities. So these are just made up examples, so don't worry about the content. But it's important to note. I'm saying that there's something you have to take note of. It is an important point I want to convey. So these cues make it easy to convey your thoughts to the reader. So I'm just going to try another example to see if you can spot some of these moves. So the example is, previous research indicates that this leads to reduced adoption by practitioners. What do you think is the main cue here which the user is trying to convey?
Evidence.
Evidence? From the use of the terms.
Indicates.
Indicates?
Previous research leads to reduce.
Okay. Anything else? Okay. Okay, I think it's all part of it if we do talk about the evidence, but the key thing here is that it's talking about prior work or background work. So previous work indicates, which means, yeah, indicates, like you said. So we're talking about something which was done by someone else. So making it clear that it's not our work, we're referring to something that was done earlier. So it's a background move. Final one, let's try this. This paper will examine how we develop contextualizable learning analytics applications.
Examine.
Yeah, examine. Anything else?
Looking ahead, like what's going to come.
Yes, yep, exactly. So here we say this paper will examine. So we are stating the goal, or what's the summary of what I'm trying to say here. So I'm clearly putting those words and phrases for the reader to make sense of what I'm trying to say. So these are some examples of rhetorical moves, and this is what AccaWriter identifies automatically from the text. So it uses natural language processing to identify patterns of the text and tag them as these moves. So we've already seen a few examples: summary, background. Another one example is called contrast move in AccaWriter. So for instance, you say, however, a recognized challenges. So you're stating some issue or something, a challenge to be noted, using these moves, saying, however, something is wrong. So you're conveying that in with those words. And there's something called question, which says, little research exists on. So you're saying there's a missing knowledge there. There's an open question there. And emphasis we saw earlier, or spotting, or saying what is new. The new model suggests you're saying this is new and innovative. So that's tagged as a novelty. And AccaWriter also tags surprise. So surprisingly, or new shocking results or something. And it also tags trends. So what happened in the past, what's happening now, is it increasing or decreasing, and all those things. So these are automatically identified by AccaWriter. And the feedback from AccaWriter looks like this. So it highlights the text with these tags, which it automatically finds. And then there are also other feedback and example tabs, which I'll talk in more detail when I go to the examples. But it identifies these tags. Okay, so we're now going back to the same gap. So there's a potential use of the tool. It picks up these things automatically. That's all great. It's a great use of tool. But how do we actually put it in practice? What's the actual use of the tool? How to make sure the students will use the tool in its in the way we intended them to use it, right? So okay, we're going back to the conceptual model for contextualizable learning analytics design. We're going to be implementing all of these all the small elements in two different examples. So these examples are from two authentic learning subjects. One is from a law subject and the other one is from an accounting subject, and they're both undergraduate level subjects in UTS. And the first example is where I'm going to be explaining this contextualization in detail, where it goes from a generic tool to a very specific tool which is giving feedback for that subject. And the next context, I'm going to be saying how it transfers from one subject to the other using some design patterns. So this is a first learning context. It's an undergraduate law subject, and as lawyers, they have to be really good with their points. They have to come up with arguments supported with evidence, and they practice the skill by writing law essays. And there are a few rubric elements which are important for that law essay. And this is their assessment criteria. So they have to engage with law and scholarly literature, and that could be mapped to the background move in AccaWriter. And the students have to write a statement of thesis, an essay plan, clearly stating what that essay is about, the topic. So that could be mapped to the summary in Acarita. Same, they have these elements are all mapped. So this is where the assessment and the features in the model come together. So we're identifying features in the text which we think are important to bring to the attention of the user, like a background is important, a summary is important, and then we try to we map it back to the assessment, saying so it's mapped to the curriculum. And so these are the first two elements. And the next one is the feedback itself. So the feedback from Acarita is actually tuned for each and every subject. So here, the feedback message is different for a law essay versus an accounting report, for example. And the examples, so in case they're missing a move which is important for that law essay, they get a feedback saying it looks like you're missing a summary move, and maybe try including linguistic cues and give them some examples from a sample, like good law essay. So that's how the feedback is tuned for this law thing. Okay, so the next, the final element is the task design, where and this is an example. So I'm just going to explain it using some design representations. And this is a conjecture mapping of that task design. That's Bill Sandoval's conjecture mapping, and I'll also be talking about some design patterns by Peter Goodyear, explain them. But so what this, so these representations kind of map the high level and the low level things together, so it connects to the pedagogy and why learners are supposed to do those tasks, what it would lead them to. So we make these conjectures about what learners might develop if they do these tasks. So the conjecture is that learners will develop their capacity to evaluate and implement rhetorical structures, and then they'll improve their writing. And this is done using some tasks and participant structures, and if they involve in these tasks, these mediating processes will evolve. Like they'll have better evaluative judgment, they'll have this revision strategies, and so on. And these little gears here are the ones which are augmented by analytics. This means that all of these tasks will work well even without the analytics and the capabilities we have. They're all very much grounded in pedagogic theory, and students will learn self-assessment and so on. But including these with the purpose of including these analytics will help it a bit more in providing more technical affordances to what's been already possible. So this is an important message which I want to convey to you today. It's about augmenting existing practice with learning analytics, and Simon will maybe talk a lot more about you if you want to talk about it, because he is writing a chapter later on this. So the concept is that there might be different ways of engaging with learning analytics and any other technological innovation for education, for instance. Like there might be evolution, where you kind of change things and you improve what you want to, or it could be revolution, like you can radically change the whole way it's been done, invent new ways of assessment. And what we argue is that the way the augmenting way, where you're just augmenting what's been done already, like the existing practice, and the good practice which has been already done will lead to better adoption, and it will bring more encourage a lot of educators to come on board, and will be more usable in the long run. So like we don't need to throw off all the old books, because there's a lot of knowledge in there. We just have to make sure that we kind of augment them with all the analytics we have. And this task design came about using a design-based approach in a few iterations over a number of semesters. And this is a design pattern from Peter Goodyear's work. So this is also a design abstraction, where you say what the problem is, what we want the students to do, and what they would learn from it, so the outcomes. So in each of these iterations, we had tasks which was augmented by analytics. The first one was the benchmarking task, where students engage with examples of different quality, like a good high quality text, a bad quality text, and so on, and they develop their evaluative judgment and improve their self-assessment. And to augment this one, we introduced texts where they were highlighted with those rhetorical moves by automated feedback or other forms of automated feedback. And this is what was augmented in the first one. And the second design, we also included a text revision activity for them, so they can apply this. Sorry, it's too small. But they're basically applying this skill of self-assessment to in practice with those revisions. So they basically improve their revision strategies with this task. And that is kind of augmented with the automated feedback. Because even without automated feedback, we can still ask students to improve a text, just go through it and maybe look what you can see, but the task is augmented with writing analytics. And in the third iteration, we also included peer discussion, which is also to further develop the evaluative judgment and the ability to explain and justify why they revise text and so on. And this peer discussion may mediate the understanding and use of automated feedback. And there's actually a short paper on why we have to combine this automated feedback and the peer discussion, and why this human component is really important in involving any of those machine related feedback. But the main things are it improves sense making. So students can discuss with each other, and it helps them make sense of the automated feedback better. And sometimes automated feedback is not perfect. It might miss certain things, and the human judgment actually covers up that, and it's a really good design where they complement each other. So this is a writing task, how it was practically implemented, and I'll go through screenshots so you get into a bit more detail. But the first one was an introductory reading or a video where the instructor explains what these rhetorical moves are and how it relates back to their discipline-oriented writing. So they actually know, so students know why they're doing it, because that's important for them to know. And so this is the task design, and the first one is the matching exercise, and then they do some self-assessment, they do a revision activity, then they involve in some peer discussion, and so on. And in the very first, in the law, there were also some study conditions. So one group was using Accurate feedback and analytics, and the other group was not using it. So for us to get a comparison of how good it was among groups and evaluated. So this is the first introduction activity. Just going to play a short video, because what they would see.
So let's just think about that a little bit. Why do we worry about whether we express attitude in relation to text? Why not just list a whole lot of concepts and leave it at that as part of a writing experience? Well, that's because as lawyers, our job is to persuade or argue in relation to a certain position. And the way that we do that in real life, in court, is we take a bunch of facts, and then we take the law, and we argue to the court that the way that we see that they should be interpreted favours a certain position or a certain outcome. So at its highest, you could have two barristers appearing in court in the final submissions with the same law, the same facts, and argue two entirely different attitudes that they feel should be preferred by the court in order to reach only one conclusion. So, for example, I might appear before the court and say, Your Honour, in relation to the removal of a caveat from a certificate of title, it's important to look at the law first and to look at what Section 74 of the Real Property Act says, but it's also useful to look at the common law, which is how judges have decided certain applications. And the sorts of things that the court would take into consideration are, and then I might talk about some cases. And my opponent might be referring to exactly the same cases. And then I might say, Your Honour, let's look at the facts of this particular case. And then I will argue certain things that should be persuasive or are more important than others. I might say, Your Honour should be more minded to the fact that my client has this property on the market for sale on Saturday and has already spent $4,000 in marketing, and that's more important than what my learned friend would say is an argument in relation to the urgency of this, because they want to borrow money against the property. And we might argue that one side should be favoured against the other because there's a certain balance of convenience. Now, this is a classic legal approach to an injunction or removing an injunction from certificates of title. But you can see how if you express attitude towards the concepts, your argument becomes persuasive. Now, that's what we want to do with essays. And the reason we do this is because law students, when they write essays, are practicing this skill, and it gives us the opportunity to give them feedback. So, in the relation...
Okay, so that's actually a long video, but I'm going to pause here just to give you that idea of how they're actually relating back to the subject, because that's going to be because that's going to involve students a lot more in the task. And the next activity was a matching exercise. It's a drag and drop interface, which it turns green if they match it correctly and red if they don't match it correctly. So these are assessment criterion elements which are mapped to example sentences. So they learn from examples, and it's a kind of a hands-on gaming task. And then they're given sample revisions to look at, which are marked up by the instructor saying, these are ways you can improve a text. So not even touching the content, just based on those structural changes, making those rhetorical moves, what changes could you make to make it of higher quality. And students are then given a text to assess. So they are thinking about what grade they would give to that sample essay and what reasons for selecting that grade, how would they improve it. So this kind of gives them a practice to involve in self-assessment with their own text, because often students, when they submit their text, they will not look at it from the point of view of a marker, because if they do, sometimes they could catch things they don't do otherwise. And then they involve in a revision and self-assessment task where they practice this skill. They use ACA-writer feedback and practice how to improve their given piece of writing using feedback. And the next one is the peer discussion. So as I said earlier, they work with peers in a class and discuss about these rhetorical moves and what changes they can make to a text. And then they do a feedback survey. It's just for us to get some idea about what they thought about the task. And after this task, they're given a quick start guide to go and use it for their own essays. When they have to submit their assignments, they can just use it, just steps to use ACA-writer and so on. So this is the first learning context where it has been used. And you can see all the 4 elements which came together, like the assessment, the learning analytics features, the tool itself, the feedback from the tool, they all, and the task design are all meshed up, and they work synchronously to give this. And I'm going to talk about the second learning context, but not in so much detail, because a lot of that actually transfers well to this context. Yep.
Can I ask a question just before we move on?
Yep,
That's all
sure.
right? Just for the previous tasks, that matching task and what you showed before,
Yep.
is that part of one set of materials the students received, or is that, pardon me, that's only the first iteration of the development to what you've achieved now, or I'm just not sure how that fits into the
So this task is actually the final iteration. So what we have right now, based on what we came up. So there were a few iterations. Not all of these tasks were there in the earlier iterations,
Okay.
but this is the final one we have for now. And we've seen that this works pretty well, and it's kind of okay. It's kind of standardized now. So this is the final iteration, and this is done in an online platform which I developed, which is not part of the tool, but it kind of gives them a practice and leads them into that tool, gives a good induction into that ACA-writer itself, using these mini tasks. Yeah, cool, go on. So that's the first context, and the second context is accounting, and they write business reports, which, as you know, are completely different from law essays. With the content itself, what they're looking for are very different. But there was still a lot of elements which could be mapped to those rhetorical moves, the features we want. So they were looking for the student's perspective on how an organization defines performance, for instance, and they did want references to previous work or background literature, they did want summary statements to convey the goals of the report. So this mapping was done again, from mapping these features and the assessment together. And the feedback was again tuned for this accounting context. So they didn't really need all of the moves, like they didn't care about the trend, they didn't care about surprise or all of these. So only the few rhetorical moves which were relevant for their context were taken, and the feedback messages were again tuned for that context. With examples from reports, for instance, you can write this report defines or the report examines and so on. So it's more relevant for the students in accounting. So this is where the feedback and UI are tuned. And this is the task design, but I'm not going to go into the details of the task like I did last time, because we used like those design patterns easily transfer from that law context to this accounting context. And they did a similar online homework, and then in week 2 they did some peer discussion in class, and then they submitted their own reports. They did self-evaluation, revision of their own reports, and they did a final submission. So it was a bit more spread over many weeks compared to the law one, but the main patterns of the tasks remained the same, and it was easily transferable to this context. Okay, so these are the two contexts, and I've seen how they were implemented, and we're now going to see a bit of how we evaluate these. And these are not the complete evaluation metrics, but I'm just going to show some scores. These are from student satisfaction scores, which these are just survey questions asking how useful did you find the task to improve your essay writing for law or for report writing for accounting students. And this is the law one, where there was one group with not receiving any automated feedback or analytics, and there was another group which received automated feedback from Writer tool. And there was a significant difference in the scores between the automated feedback and the no feedback groups. So the automated feedback group students rated it much higher. So it was around 3.7, the mean was around 3.7. And this is the number of students who completed the whole activity, because the questions were asked in the end of the activity. So, and in accounting, there were about 302 students, because it was scaled up to a much larger cohort, and the usefulness score was about 3.8. So it was pretty much around 1 was not useful at all, and 5 was like very useful. So it was pretty much around useful, moderate, on useful, so on. Okay, but around 66% is around useful or very useful, which is actually okay. And a few more like student responses from the qualitative data we collected on what they thought about the task. And there's one response from a student which says, generally when you're editing your writing, you automatically think that your work sounds good. And this tool indicated areas where I needed to be more explicit, which on my own I would not have noticed. So that's kind of bringing them some evaluative judgment and self-assessment. And so this student also thought it made him think about the importance of having a clear writing, but they do recognize that it's limited to recognizing extremely plain language. So maybe the student tried a few other things like complex language, but the tool probably didn't pick it up, which is really good, because we do want them to engage with the tool and identify and challenge the tool where it has missed some things or it doesn't work as they expected. And the student says it's like having a tutor or another person check and give constructive feedback, so it's useful. And the student says it might be of use to some more than others, and it still thinks a human reading is more effective, which is obviously sometimes students find it hard to accept anything that is put in front of them from you. So we do have to tell them it's not taking away anything you already have, it's just an additional support. We're not taking away your tutors or any other human feedback, it's just giving some additional support. And the student saying, it has broadened my perspective and I'm more aware of the way I'm writing now. So this is a really good step which we want them to head towards. Another student says, I'm not sure how useful Writer actually is, other than providing some general feedback Obviously, it doesn't provide feedback on the whole writing, like how a human would give feedback. It just covers a few aspects of it, and which is why it's really good to have a human judgment as well put into it and think of other factors. Cool. And I'm not going to go into big details about all the analytics and the revision strategies, because that's probably for another talk about all the data things. But this is just a bit of analysis which was run by comparing the two groups, one using Accuriter and the other not using Accuriter. And the group using Accuriter introduced a lot more moves, rhetorical moves in their writing, and compared to the groups which were not using Accuriter feedback. So that's coming from the revision products. Okay. And what I'm going to do next is I'm also working to interview instructors, because we've seen some student feedback to see how they thought about it, but we also want to understand the educator views, because they are in fact the main driving force behind all of these things. So I'm just going to ask about their motivation, or why they decided to work with us, what they thought they would benefit from, how they implemented it, and how they thought students used it, and any other findings, what value they thought it added, and if they would use it again in the future. But so far we've seen that they always use it again in the next semester because they thought it's useful. Okay, so started with this. I talked a bit about this balancing scalability and contextualization for learning analytics, and we've talked a lot about contextualizing learning analytics. And this scalability can come from scaling up to more numbers of students, and one example I showed was how we transferred these patterns from one cohort, and not even one cohort, but from one discipline to another discipline itself. So this way we can actually scale it also to more numbers. And when we have standardized tests or assessments, we can also use these kind of tools to provide scalable things. And they can generalize to any number of students as long as we map it back to their context. Okay, so that's almost near the end of the talk. And just to give you a bit of recap, so I talked about contextualizable learning analytics design and a model to develop learning analytics which is aligned to learning design. So I talked about those components of assessment, task design from learning design, which are driven by educators, and features, feedback, and UI, which are driven by learning analytics designers, and how they should all work synchronously and mesh together for the whole mechanism to work. And then I also talked about augmenting existing pedagogic practice. So we do include things which are grounded by theory, existing practice, good practice, and we find ways to augment it with learning analytics, so it leads to better adoption. And yeah. So, and I also talked about the use of design representations, like the design patterns and conjecture mapping, to transfer good designs from the context to another context. Okay. So there are a few implications and further thoughts for discussion. And so one of that is, if we could think of elements which might contribute to contextualizability of learning analytics, or other ways of scaling up to more learners, or if you could think of other examples of learning analytics other than writing. Is there anything else we might think about? And the concept of making systems and designs malleable to the needs of the educator, I think that is an important point, because we're giving this agency and power to the educators, because that might improve adoption. And would those systems ensure more transparency rather than being black box algorithms that no one knows what it's about or can't change any aspect of it? How would that affect transparency in learning analytics? And if there are any ethical considerations, data, privacy issues, and so on. These are a few thoughts for discussion. We'll come back to it in a while. But I also wanted to introduce this project. It's called the Higher Education Text Analytics HETA project. And UTS Connected Intelligence Center is leading this project with a few other ATN universities. And the Accuriter has been released open source as part of this project, and a lot of resources and blogs on what's happening around writing analytics. So if you're interested, go take a look. It's heta.io. And if I also have the slide where you can like do a demo if you have a computer, if you want to try out that tool. There's a demo there and a sample text you can try out. You can put your own text if you have an abstract or your student writing or anything. Just try out and see what rhetorical move it picks up. So that's the URL. And I want to thank all the people who are involved in this project. Obviously the supervisors, Simon Buckinghamshire and Simon Knight. I also have the academic collaborators from law, accounting. I think those academics really bring in a lot of energy and enthusiasm to the project to make it work really well. And all the colleagues in KIC and student participants. So yeah, I'm going to stop there and take any questions and your comments, feedback, anything. And I'm on Twitter, Shibani Antonette, and my blog is AntonetteShibani.com. I actually have a bit of mismatch in my first name, given name, so I have a lot of confusing names. But I go with Shibani. There's a long story behind my long name if you want to talk about it sometime. So I have 5 names actually. That's a long story for some other time. But I usually go by Shibani, so that's where you can find me. And I'm going to point to this demo and also open the floor for questions or any comments. So if you want to log in, you can log in and you can start shooting your questions. Thank you so much.